Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Pete McGratty. I'm the VP of Strategic Partnerships at Pinnacle Advisor Solutions. On behalf of John Hill and Gary Seifried and myself at Pinnacle Advisor Solutions, and Chris Wynn and Brian Young and Tom Yates at Advisor Assist, and Tim Villano at Artemis Global Security, we'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar titled, Are You Equipped to Prevent and Detect a Cyber Attack? A little background. Pinnacle Advisory Group's an independent wealth management firm that provides comprehensive financial planning and investment management on a fee-only basis to high net worth individuals and families in the DC metropolitan area and the greater Miami area. You may be more familiar with Michael Kitsis, who's our Director of Wealth Management and a partner at our firm. I run a division for Pinnacle Advisory Group called Pinnacle Advisor Solutions. We provide outsourcing solutions to other independent wealth management firms around the country. These solutions include non-client facing activities like investment management, back office, technology, as well as compliance in partnership with Advisor Assist. It was in this latter capacity that Chris Wynn and Brian Young and I started talking about putting this webinar together. You know, collectively, we speak to hundreds of independent wealth management firms around the country. And what we've both seen repeatedly is that cybersecurity is becoming much more important in terms of how firms should run their practices, how advisors should run their practices, but also a growing curiosity, a growing interest in understanding the issues and consequences and best practices around cybersecurity as we speak to them. Naturally, as there are more cyber attacks taking place every day, naturally they are looking for guidance about how to prepare and defend against those attacks, and when attacked, what's the proper procedure to clean up the mess. A few quick stats based on the survey questions that people completed when they were registering. We had about 150 responses, so it's a pretty good sample. First observation is a good news, bad news. The good news is only 5% of you indicated that you experienced a cyber attack in the last 12 months. That said, many cyber attacks many advisors are often not aware that they have been attacked. And regardless, we all know that these attacks are taking place with growing frequency. So it remains, regardless of the smaller percentage of attacks, of those of you who indicated that you had been attacked, this is something that needs to be addressed because we're going to be facing more and more of it. Some additional good news. Most of you are already aware that this is an important issue and have started to focus on it. Some 93% of you indicated that you already have a cybersecurity policy in place. And that 88% of you have been taking steps in the last 12 months to improve your cybersecurity. That said, there's still some of you that have are at ground zero and have some work to do, and hopefully this webinar will give you some thoughts about where to get started. And then finally, even though we've got people are paying attention and starting to take steps, there's still some more work to do. Using two simple steps to help defend against cyber attacks, that being using dual-factor authentication or email encryption. The good news is about 73% of you are using dual-factor and about 66% of you are using email encryption. But that still leaves about a third of you who need to put those relatively easy and helpful steps in place. With that, I'm going to hand the conversation over to our two guest speakers. The first one is Tom Yates. He's a senior compliance consultant at Advisor Assist. He works with advisors around the country with their ongoing compliance and practice management. And we also have with us Tim Villano, the Chief Information Officer for Artemis Global Security. Artemis focuses on doing IT security consulting for RIAs, including and provides both help with cybersecurity as well with managed technology services. So we have two of the experts here to talk about how to handle this from a practical standpoint, a technology standpoint, as well as a compliance standpoint. And I'm very happy to introduce the two of you to Tom and Tim.
Thank you very much, Pete. So with regards to today's presentation on cybersecurity, we'll basically go over the basics of the implementations of policies and procedures as it pertains to your compliance program. And in addition to that, then Tim Villano will take over and discuss the technical aspects, the use cases that are surrounding cybersecurity in the industry today. Just an introduction with regards to cybersecurity. I mean, the idea of a registered investment advisor is to act as a fiduciary. As part of that fiduciary, there are two rules that also goes along with it with regards to Regulation SP or Reg SID, with regards to the protection of client-sensitive information, but also maintain the integrity of client assets to protect from identity theft. So what needs to be done is the implementation of certain policies and procedures with regards to protections from external or internal sources of cybersecurity threats. This means that you have controls that are truly defining those safeguards as clients are entrusting you with this sensitive information. As part of those policies and procedures, you want to make sure you have an understanding of who is responsible for the various aspects of your procedures, whether it's an internal resource or it is an external vendor that will help you ensure the implementation of those policies and procedures. You want to ensure that these policies and procedures are a living and breathing document. These are supposed to reflect your actual practices. Therefore, if you do identify areas of review as part of your testing or your assessments of vulnerability and identify these areas of risk, that you're taking the opportunity to mitigate those risks and update your practices and policies so that further controls are reflected in your practices. Other aspects of implementing a policy and procedure for cybersecurity is understanding what your resources are. If you have internal resources such as an IT individual or operations or compliance individual responsible for the implementation of cybersecurity, purchasing security software for encryptions or firewalls. But ultimately, you as a CCO, you as a compliance individual, if you are unfamiliar or you just don't understand what needs to be implemented, I mean, it's best to always leverage the resources that are available, but also potentially engage a vendor as well, as a collaboration, a partnership between a cybersecurity vendor and advisor will go a long way with ensuring the protection of client-sensitive information. Tim, was there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I'll just add that we still walk into a lot of firms in the context of an information security assessment, and the firms have not really assigned responsibility properly. We'll talk about it going forward and some of the guidance that's out there, but the SEC has talked quite a bit about governance and risk management, et cetera, and they are expecting that you are going to assign a person who's responsible for IT security at the firm. They have actually used the term CISO, which I know we're familiar with. I don't think it's necessary that every firm go out and put that title in place, but it is important that you have sort of a clear chain of command, and in all likelihood that is a question, a future examination question. You know, who is the person here who wears the hat? Sorry to say that for the CCO that might fall on, but that's something that definitely the SEC is looking for, you know, as far as governance is concerned. Who's in charge, or who is the person responsible for IT security, and how are those roles assigned at the firm?
So as part of the implementation of the policy and procedures, one thing to really pay attention to is the delivery of sending client-sensitive information. And what is client-sensitive information? It's data, it is accounts, it's social security numbers, essentially any information with regards to the client that is not available to the public and would be deemed harmful if exposed to the public is deemed a sensitive form of information. So as part of that, if you're sending items via email, you want to ensure that there are protective measures in place of delivering that information. One way is to implement encryptions in your emails. Other ways are using secure portals or secure folders or cloud folders to share this information. Ultimately, you want to ensure that the delivery, but also the receipt of this information is in fact secure. so you can protect from any malicious intrusion or interception of this information. The other controls is effective to data. You want to be able to have your data protected from malicious intrusions. And this can be done through encryption of devices, implementing firewalls in your networks, and even simply as just ensuring that you have an adequate antivirus in place, as this will ensure that there is no exploitation or essentially recidivist exploitations to your security or your data as well.
So just a quick, I'll just make a quick comment, Tom, on say you're sending sensitive information. The SEC did have an alert out, or OC had an alert out on April 16th of 2019 that discuss that. It's an alert that everyone is, I think it would be a good idea to take a look at as the SEC gets more specific with the IT security information that they're putting out there and actually mentioning specific controls. Just to drill down a little bit on the IT side, from an encryption standpoint, full disk encryption has become much easier. Everybody, I'm sure there are many people out there that are aware of that with Windows 10, BitLocker encryption is not difficult to deploy. And while I'm mentioning that, I'll also mention that last week was an important week with the end of life for Windows 7 and also Server 2008 R2. So if you still have we've been very busy dealing with Windows 7 systems, just something for you to keep in mind. At the firewall, we'll talk about some of the testing that needs to take place, but whether it's vulnerability scanning or penetration testing, understanding what ports, protocols, and services are available on the firewall, understanding what remote access services are in place, like firewalls or other forms of remote access. And as far as antivirus is concerned, that's really a point on which all advisors want to, sort of pause and say, what is the best antivirus product for us? And right now we're talking about and looking at a lot of different products that are effective with ransomware. And we'll talk about ransomware more, but how to stop a ransomware attack and roll back vis-a-vis the antivirus package that you have in place.
Other aspects of your policies and procedures that you really want to make sure you have kind of controls in place for is facilities, right? Is your office secure? Is only authorized personnel or permitted individuals inside the office? You want to ensure that these devices that you might have laid out, your iPads, your computers, that they are securely locked, or that the only people that have access or can gain access to this are authorized personnel of the advisor. In addition, you want to ensure that you have updated systems in place. If there's a software update, if your antivirus prompts you to make an update, if your CRM or any other vendor you leverage has an update that needs to go in place, that you do accept and ensure those implementations of updates do occur. This is not just about performance, but it's also if there are certain issues in security that needs patching over, these updates will ensure that those are exploitation or then mitigated. Lastly, you want to ensure that there is adequate vigilance. Vigilance can come in the form of training, but just a true identification of suspicious activity. Being prompted to enter in a password on a phishing email, ransomware type scams, which Tim will go into later in today's discussion. But generally, any activities that don't seem familiar, that seem suspicious. One use case is we had an advisor that was having emails delivered from his email, but he was not aware of those deliveries. And the client effectively had to make him aware of those deliveries. So how can you detect for these activities? But are there anything else suspicious that needs to be reported to the CCO or responsible party?
The subject of updating systems, I think, is critical right now. In fact, I'm sure there are people out there that are aware of the Emergency Directive 2002 from last week that Microsoft put out an emergency patch that Microsoft, the Department of Homeland Security suggested that firms put in place within 10 days. So I'm sure you're experiencing this with your MSP or your internal IT people, but we're waking up this morning and validating patching, validating that has taken place, and they're important security components. The other thing I'll say, just from an awareness standpoint, is there is actually a zero-day exploit out there for Internet Explorer that people should be aware of. Microsoft has told everybody it's being exploited in the wild. Unfortunately, they do not have the patch for that yet, but the people who work for you, your advisors, your personnel, really should be prepared for that as soon as there is a patch available, that we get that implemented quickly. And of course, we will. All of these issues are related. Patching is looked at as a remedy for ransomware, and oftentimes is, but we will discuss that as we roll forward a bit.
In addition to those controls, right, I think one thing a practice and advisor should always have in place is an inventory of access to sensitive information. If you think about all the devices that have access to this information, you want to be able to understand or be able to identify which devices do have access, what type of information it has access to, and the types of securities that are in place, so that you have an understanding of what controls need to be implemented, or if there needs to be enhancements to your current security. Effectively, there should never be an unapproved device accessing client-sensitive information. Understanding your systems, the securities behind your systems, so that, once again, if there are potential malicious attempts, that your systems are already up to date and have protective measures in place to prevent them. And lastly is gauging vendors, gauging CRMs, your custodian, portfolio management systems, or even your IT vendor. You want to be able to perform adequate due diligence on these third parties, as you are now relying on them to service your clients. Therefore, there needs to be an understanding of what their cybersecurity practices are, how they go about reacting to potential cybersecurity threats, and of course, collaborating with you to ensure that as a collective unit, that you have confidence in the security of your information and identity theft issues as well.
The concept of inventories that you touched on, I'll just add a little bit to that Tom. That's the CIS controls and other controls that are important to IT professionals. That's really number one. That's also, the SEC asked for inventories with respect to hardware and software going back into the first cybersecurity sweep in 2014. The concept being, you can never understand what shouldn't be on your network if you don't understand what belongs. A lot of managed service providers and some applications allow you, obviously, to keep continuous track of this, so you can produce an inventory at any time, so you can produce an inventory of software that's on the network. So it's important to know what's available to you from an application standpoint for producing that information, but also there are quite a few controls out there, as far as devices are concerned, that can be whitelisted or prevented from joining a network and blocking devices, etc. So the concept of inventories is going to remain important, and I think it flows directly to the document request list as the SEC transitions to that part of this program.
Effectively, when I have conversations with advisors, I always will get the question, this is too much information, I don't understand, I don't have the resources to truly implement the cybersecurity policy and the protection of client-sensitive information. Well, first and foremost, as I mentioned before, engaging a vendor may be important and key to ensuring the protection of client-sensitive information. But there are aspects of your policy and procedures that do not need a cybersecurity vendor. And these are human controls that effectively anyone can implement to enhance the controls and protection of client information. First and foremost is passwords. You want to ensure that you have complex passwords in place, that you have at least 8 characters, 1 capital letter and 1 special character. And you don't want to use passwords or street names, your favorite dog, your birth date or your child's birth date. as these are easy passwords for malicious intruders to identify and leverage to gain access to information. The other aspect that you want to have in place for passwords is two-factor authentication. Just putting in some form of control that in case someone does have access or does have your password, that there is another form or another way to ensure or control to ensure that who is accessing or who is logging in is truly you. Another control that you can ensure you put in place is data delivery. And this is the first and the simple part of this is ensuring the intended recipient is actually receiving what was being provided. You do not want to send account details, social security numbers to the wrong party. In addition, you want to ensure that it's only authorized individuals that are accessing this information as well, whether it's a third party for servicing the client, and once again, the client altogether. As part of that delivery, you want to ensure you identify this information as well. So if you do see social securities, you do see account details, that it is being delivered in an encrypted or another secure manner. Last control you can really put in place for from the human element is when or where you access information. You never want to access information through an unapproved device, as those devices may not have the appropriate securities in place. You never want to access or deliver information in public networks. So if you're working out of a Starbucks, you want to avoid the usage of public networks, as once you log on and attempt to deliver some information, anyone else who has access to that public network has a higher probability, as it is a less secure network of this information being hosted. So you want to either use a mobile hotspot that's not connected to the internet, or you want to install a virtual private network, which essentially creates a portal, an encrypted portal for you as if you are on a private network. And lastly, you never want to allow unapproved third parties to access devices. And this doesn't just mean third parties or other third parties to engage. This could also mean family members. Allowing your child or other significant other to access or use devices may potentially expose that device to some sort of virus or malware, as they may not be trained up on your cybersecurity practices and controls. So therefore, the risk becomes higher of those types of malicious intrusions or attempts occurring on those devices.
Yeah, and there's so much to talk about here, and Tom, you talked about a lot of important controls, but I'm just going to pile onto the two-factor notion here. Pete mentioned it in his opening remarks. You know, if there really are a third of advisors out there who haven't implemented two-factor, especially for your email services, Office 365 or Google or whatever you may use for email, I would recommend that you go back and prioritize it, put it in place immediately. You know, on almost a weekly basis, we're seeing business email compromise that could have been prevented by having two-factor in place. I'd also, you know, for the 2/3 of advisors out there that have two-factor in place, review your cloud-based services and platforms, especially if there's client information kept there, any information that you think is important, your CRM platforms, human HR information, payroll information for your employees. So, you know, think out of the box a little bit on the cloud-based services, and anywhere you can put two-factor in place, put it in place. This is going back to 2015, the Cybersecurity Examination Initiative. I'll mention this document at least a few times, but the SEC says on the front page of that document, they're going to look at those cases where two-factor is in place and where two-factor isn't. And if you can twist a dial, make sure that you do. We view this as kind of a Murphy's Law thing. If you don't go back and do it this week, someone will be breached next week. And obviously it ties to simple password, the concept of simple passwords or password reuse. However, if there was one message that I could say to people that I think would be of help to you is review your two-factor practices, put it in place where it isn't in place, and you know that's an issue to address immediately.
And kind of last thing to add to this implementation of policy and procedures is ensure that there's adequate training in place. This is a way that you can educate your supervised persons to understand what their roles and obligations are as it pertains to cybersecurity, so that they can fulfill their end as part of this practice. You also want to be able to educate them on these types of red flags, these phishing emails, these ransomware attacks, suspicious emails from clients, or even items that may not be familiar for identity theft approach. Want to be able to train these of your supervised persons on these aspects. And lastly is just understanding how to respond to certain cybersecurity incidents. What is the notification process? Who you're going to report to? Do you have an action plan in place so that there is a remediation step and notification to the appropriate parties on what actions are going to occur? So Tim will go a little bit more into the aspects of responding to cybersecurity threats.
Sure. I'll just pick up where you left off, Tom, and I think it's that notion of training and reporting and escalation that's very important. We're finding it as critical at firms, especially if there are issues like ransomware that take place. Ransomware can transmit through a network laterally, so timely reporting, timely isolation of systems is critically important. I'm not going to talk about everything with respect to incident response and business continuity, but what I can tell you is it's become just as important to have some tools in place that help you with logging of information, that help you with monitoring and detection on systems and networks. We're seeing firms that are breached that have no visibility on their networks, and then they do not have the capability to say, the breach or the ransomware attack was limited to actually crypto locking files as opposed to exfiltrating data. So it's important to have some visibility into your network, to think about the tool set that's in place, so that you can properly document or forensically address a breach if it should take place, but also that you can rule out or say, hackers did not do this. They did not exfiltrate data. They did not access this particular drive or share. The other thing that I'll mention is that, a document that's been around for some time is the Department of Defense the Department of Defense document on breach, and this is an important document for helping you define what your pre-breach steps are and your post-breach steps might be. Oftentimes we're walking into firms, and even if they have a cyber policy, they don't have an incident response plan in place, and that's the kind of thing, if we walk into a firm and that's the situation, we remedy that almost immediately, because the last thing you want to have happen is a serious security event without having an incident response plan in place. So that's another thing to bubble to the top of the list. And as you're thinking about it, it's not a bad idea to review the Department of Defense's document from, they continue to update it. They most recently updated in September 2018, but best practices for victim response and reporting of cyber incidents. So, plenty to consider there, but it's a good idea to get an actionable plan in place, especially if you should have a problem. You always want to say, we've had this in place.
So with regards to the implementation or the write-up of a plan and kind of leveraging your resources, how do you go about testing potential incident response for cybersecurity?
It's very simple at BCP, and I know that investment advisors and people out there are familiar to that. You can start gradually with testing, but what's important to the SEC, and what's important from a alerting and a policy and procedure standpoint. So you can have next week or the week after have a desktop at your business about ransomware. What do we intend to do if a single system were ransomwared on our network? What are the steps that we take? What do we do if it's a distributed attack and multiple systems are affected? So I think the first step is really start to talk about these things, talk about testing, and then scale up. Similar to the notion of BCP, scaling up from simple tests to a full failover. But consider your pre-breach steps. Those would be your system controls, your patching that's implemented. If you have tools for monitoring and detection, if you have logging of system capability or network devices like firewalls, making sure that that's in place and it can be used for forensic process. Difficult to explain to regulators why you don't have any of that, why you wouldn't have any of that stuff in place. But there are a few notions. It's really a vast subject, but I would say, it's get it down on paper and start with simple notions for testing and desktop reviews. Okay. Just a few notions. I won't spend enormous time on this slide, but along with the governance notion of naming your person who is responsible for IT security at the firm, you always want to think of your committee participation. We all know that have been in the business for a long time. The SEC has now been talking about risk management, enterprise risk management. I think it's now approaching 8 years or so. They're beginning to write deficiencies to firms who can't demonstrate that they have processes there. So the only other thing I want to mention with the notion of cyber, which I don't mean to make it overcomplicated or we want to try to simplify it wherever we can. But, if you're reviewing your vendors, if you're conducting vendor due diligence of critical vendors who manage client information or other important processes at the firm, bring it into the committee process, bring it into the compliance committee, the risk committee, or the information security committee if you have that. So this really shouldn't all fall at the footstep of the CCO. So I say quite a few of these processes related to IT security you can review at the committee level, whether it's some of the testing that we'll discuss, or whether it's reporting, or whether it's assessments you may receive. Bring the committee involved, and also your IT persons or IT competent persons, especially if you happen to manage your program internally.
So what you mentioned, bringing these committees together for the implementation and due diligence. I mean, what about the advisors that don't have that level of resource? So smaller 1, 2, 3 person shops, or just simply shops that don't have the teams put together for this. This could potentially just be gibberish for them. What can they do, or how do they perform their due diligence efforts?
It's difficult, and I think your efforts, whether it's cybersecurity or IT, or whether it's vendor management, it's always going to be sort of in line with the size and scope of the activities of the firms. But there's no pass for smaller firms. If you have critical client information at a cloud-based vendor, there has to be some level of review. That is the case where it might come down to one person, or as we know with lots of small firms, they may have 3 persons who participate in several different committees. But we've seen the SEC, the NFA talking to smaller firms at this point. The examination process is not going to omit those firms. So there's a level of participation that is definitely expected. So I would say you cannot ignore vendor management. What you can do is sort of limit it and say, okay, who are the 3 most critical vendors here? Or what is the definition of critical vendor for us? Is it a critical vendor is defined as someone who deals with client information, or someone that provides a process that is essential to our business? So smaller firms, I would say, should look for ways to control this process and limit it. So you're not necessarily conducting due diligence of 35 firms, but maybe your 5 critical vendors.
And with regards to those critical vendors, I mean, is there a certain key points that advisors should be looking for? Terms that would either be a red flag or a kind of a positive check mark in their due diligence?
I think so. Here's what I will tell you. I think that every firm, if they have a critical vendor or a vendor that manages client information, you want to go out to that firm. Do they have a security requirements document? Do they have a business continuity document? Can they provide you with that information? If we're talking about a cloud-based platform, what is the security at the dashboard like? Are there administrative persons at the firm that log into an administrative dashboard for a cloud-based service? Have you applied 2-factor authentication to administrators logging into that service? So what kind of security requirements have taken place there? If we're talking about smaller advisors, and you are able to do this, which is not always the case. It really doesn't happen too often, but it is the case sometimes that you can arrange a call for due diligence and document that and talk about what firms are doing with data as far as encryption is concerned, as far as transfer of, as far as data at rest and data in transit. So as far as managing their people, what is their security program like? Do they have a SOC 1 or SOC 2 certification or other IT certifications that are important to you? So unfortunately, it's never a cookie cutter process, but you want to make sure that you are making an effort to go out and obtain information. And if you need to go a level deeper, you consider that.
Would you say a relationship with these vendors would also be key? Hopefully putting all these terms in some sort of layman's stance?
If a relationship with the vendor is possible, and it just depends on how large the vendor is. No one's going to have a personal relationship with Microsoft or Bloomberg or some of the services that we see advisors have on the desktop. However, I think it's at the very least, it's important to go out and obtain the due diligence that they provide. In cases where you can and do have communication with vendors, does your firm have a DDQ? Do you have a questionnaire that you're distributing to those vendors that you can bring back? Then you can actually define and make your questions pointed. And I think that's a good idea. That demonstrates some level of interaction. So whether or not you're going to have a relationship and communication really depends on the size of the vendor and whether or not they'll go to those lengths. So it turns into a little bit of a game of aggregating information. And for those vendors that you can communicate with, you do try to develop that. Okay, so just a quick word about where we see the SEC right now, and so everyone out there should have a clear understanding that we're nearing the end of the third sweep process. Now, we've been to the SEC, and they represented that there was going to be a third sweep, and there may be other sweeps, but they've sort of said that this is the final notion, and we're expecting that in the next 6 months we'll see findings from this process. As they have put out deficiencies or places, areas of weakness, et cetera. So we'll see that from the third sweep that takes place. What we really think the significance here is that we're shifting from the sweep process, from the gathering of information that the SEC has talked about. We know that's been a painful process as well, to incorporating this into the regular examination process. So we see it as an important point, a critical point out here, where advisors have to stop thinking about how do we deal with the next sweep, to this is going to be built in the regular examination process, and how can we gain some insight and information and prepare for that.
Is there any kind of recommendations that you might have in preparing for either a cyber sweep or even potentially having these cybersecurity aspects be asked in a regular full exam?
Yes, I mean, I think it's very clear. The SEC has given a very clear roadmap here. And I said I would mention this document again that's on the right side of the screen, the 2015 Cybersecurity Examination Initiative. And with this initiative, there were 6 points of focus, but perhaps more important, there is an appendix that is a document request. Items from the third sweep were taken directly from that appendix. So, if I really had some advice to prepare for what's going to happen with cyber and the regular examination process, pick up this document from 2015, put the appendix on the table, look at the document request there, because the SEC really has shown us the road that they're driving down, and they've mentioned those same 6 points from this document in the 2020 examination priorities. So they're really, you can feel comfortable that there aren't any secrets here, that they have put everything on the table, and that I think there's a clear path for preparing for examination.
Is there a difference in expectation on cloud-based users or cloud-based advisors versus a server-based advisor for controls that need to be placed for advisors?
I think the answer to that, there are differences, Tom, but it really doesn't change. Whether you have internal networking and systems and your systems are maintained internally, they're going to go down the road of inquiring about that. In fact, like I said, the SEC has begun to issue more granular guidance than we would have anticipated at this point. But in May of 2019, OC put out a document about network storage, both internal and also maintained by third parties. That document's a great example of how they're going to ask whether your network storage is internal or whether it's maintained in the cloud or at a cloud-based provider, some of the controls that they're going to inquire about. So to us, it really doesn't matter whether the advisor's program is internal or whether it's primarily cloud-based. If it's primarily cloud-based, we have to go through the exercise that's more about due diligence of the vendor practices, more about how administrative persons at the firm are accessing, more about how those cloud-based applications are accessed within the network and on workstations. So whether you're in the cloud or whether you're all internal as far as your networking and program is concerned, you're going to have to answer to these questions. You're going to have to provide information. There's no real pass, and everybody out here has heard the old regulatory saw. You can outsource the process, but you can't outsource responsibility, and I think that's the real story as far as vendor management in the cloud is concerned.
In your experience, where can you name off the top 5 points of risk areas RIAs are kind of falling under here for cybersecurity issues?
Certainly. I mean that next slide really we've tried to talk about these, but again, there aren't any secrets here. We could have put up all kinds of statistics and information and from different studies and Verizon and all these studies that take place over the course of the year. But the bottom line is, the studies aren't great. Everyone out here knows, and everyone who's on the webinar knows, issues are out there and continue to get worse in some cases. So, the FBI and the federal government, they are saying that the biggest risks that, financial firms, that firms in general are facing are business email compromise, number one, and ransomware would be number two. And the SEC has commented on those things as well, and so those are areas where perhaps we should have policies and procedures. To us, it's more important that our practices are nailed down. Like, as you mentioned, Tom, that we put two-factor authentication in place. If we can't put two-factor in place for Office 365 or other platforms like that, what are the compensating controls? What is our password length and complexity? When do we roll it over? How do we assure that people internally are not reusing passwords, which we've seen specifically lead to breach and create difficult circumstances for advisors. As far as ransomware is concerned, there were a number of high-profile attacks over the holidays. 300 firms or so woke up on the West Coast to a significant ransomware attack, some of which are financial services firms. And, we have to have an understanding of ransomware, how it occurs, how it moves within a network, or, what are the controls surrounding our MSP to ensure that we don't have a distributed attack that comes from another entity. I mentioned when we talked about antivirus, there is antivirus out there which is resistant to ransomware or will stop and roll back a crypto locker, an encryption process. So those are things to be aware of. But the biggest risks out here for advisors at this point, I would think, number one, assume you are under attack because we're seeing enough evidence that is taking place. Number two, if you haven't nailed down your share file or business applications, please go back, like I said before, and put two-factor in place. And then you have to consider, what do we do in the event of a ransomware attack?
So you mentioned earlier kind of issues going on with Windows. Are there other OS or devices that may be less vulnerable than the current Microsoft platforms?
Well, when there's malware that's written for specific devices is going to create problems. However, the vast majority of attacks that we're seeing, and this isn't a surprise because people out here who are on the webinar, your programs are built on Windows. We still have this document-based Microsoft approach, PDFs that we're providing to the SEC, and et cetera. And so the greatest risk that we're seeing is with Windows-based platforms, workstations, servers, and laptops. And the reason that is occurring is, the majority of ransomware is written for Windows systems. It's written using native Microsoft Windows tools like PowerShell and Command Prompt, and what they call in the business living off the land of the existing tools that are in place. My personal belief is that Apple and Mac are targeted less, therefore they're a little bit more secure, but they do have a built-in root access and confirmation of password for changes in services. So in other words, you can have one of the real dangers for Windows accounts is that many people out there still have administrative access. And if a bad guy finds their way onto your machine with administrative access, there's a lot of damage that they can do. So iPhones and Apple devices in general, we see them as quite secure. I mean, the Attorney General asked last week for Apple to decrypt 2 phones used in a terrorist event. So Apple we see as quite secure, and there are actually no known exploits in the field. Apple does a good job with patching their devices, but we all on this webinar, I think, live in a Windows universe, and that's why most of the malware is being written for the Windows desktop.
And so for these malwares, these business email compromises, or any other kind of intrusion, I mean, what does the contingency look like? What does the response actually look like?
Okay, listen, business email compromise, if we are called in to assist a firm where they've had a business email compromise, the first step is really applying 2-factor authentication to that account or to that user that's been compromised. Applying 2-factor instantly kicks out anyone in Office 365 who has not previously applied 2-factor. So it's a great control from that standpoint. And then of course there's an ensuing forensic process that begins with looking at the email archive. How many years old is it? What are the contents of the email? Is there personal identifiable information out there? Is any notification of clients going to be necessary from that breach? But I will tell you, in those cases really where someone has been breached as far as business email compromise or the Office 365 example is concerned, 2-factor for that person that is breached and everyone else across the organization. And there's a great deal of breach and a lot of pain that could be avoided by people going to that process and putting it in place. It is, you never want to have to explain to someone we didn't put it in place because it wasn't convenient for us, or management didn't want us to put it in place, that type of thing. As far as ransomware is concerned, when we see ransomware, if we do see ransomware on a desktop, we're interested in system isolation, detaching it from the network as quickly as possible, because ransomware has what they call wormable and move from system to system on a network. That's how some of the major breaches like Sony took place. On the right-hand side of this slide is the SEC's ransomware alert from 2017, specific to WannaCry and NotPetya, and those were sort of game-changing or very important events out there that let people know that ransomware could, move laterally or worm across a network. So, initially in the case of ransomware, it's really isolation, detaching a system from a network. Sometimes we'll isolate all the systems on a network if we see that, but that would be the important and first step. So just a quick mention of the examination priorities. Here's the one-pager that accompanied the 2020 examination priorities. Right, you can see that little box on the right. Do you know that OC has already prioritized cyber in each of its 5 examination programs? Well, we didn't see so much of it, but we know it's coming. So again, this isn't some out of bounds prediction in any way or form. The SEC is telling us what they're doing. They're moving cyber and IT security to the regular examination process within this one-page blurb in the exam priorities, you can see the 6 points of the 2015 initiative. And again, I'll refer you back to the most important part of that document, which is the appendix that has a document request attached to it. So if you had never put that document on the table, put it on the table. If you have put it on the table, bring it up again and look at the document request. That's what the SEC was asking in sweep number 3. That's likely, with a narrowed focus, what they're going to continue to do as far as the examination process is concerned.
Beyond just the SEC examination priorities, I mean, are there other rules, other laws that advisors should be aware of as it pertains to client information in cybersecurity?
Yes, certainly. State law is a big issue, and I'm sure there are probably firms out there that are aware of, CCPA and California Consumer Privacy Act, the New York Department of Financial Services, cybersecurity law, state laws for notification, under what circumstances and what is the definition for personal identifiable information within the state of residence for your clients. So, so I would say yes, there always are other laws. Certain firms, maybe GDPR dependent and have to consider that, but really I think it's first and foremost state law, especially if we're considering how do we respond to an attack, or if you happen to be subject to one of these larger rules like the New York Department of Financial Services. So yeah, there's quite a bit of information out there beyond the SEC's guidance and Reg SP and Reg SID. And here we go. Here's a good example of it. Tom mentioned red flags earlier here, and I'm sure that everyone is familiar with the VOIA breach, and it probably discussed it at this point. We want to mention it again. And the reason we're mentioning it again is because it was detailed or discussed in the examination priorities. That small paragraph there said, here are the 6 points of the 2015 examination initiative, and we're also going to be examining on Reg SID, or identity theft and red flags. No surprise, because the SEC had their first enforcement, invoked it in this case. And I think what's most important is, first and foremost, understanding when they come in or during the regular examination, they're probably going to talk to you about Reg SID and identity theft. They're going to look at the program. The deficiencies or inadequacies on VOIA's part, there were problems with their training. The SEC saw their training program as weak. People who were actually involved in the breach did not attend trainings. So I'm afraid we're all going to be suffering for that for a long time. They also failed to update their red flags. Most people in 2013, put Reg SID into the manual and forgot about it. And if you've had security incidents or events at the firm, you need to take a look at them and say, can we add red flags? How can we now make Reg SID more of a living document, which is what the SEC is expecting and what they're going to be examining on. I also think the very broad movement took place here from, Reg SID was initially put in place with a focus on wire fraud and wiring process. However, when we look at VOIA, there is fraud involved, but it's very much IT security risk. Should you be adding a red flag that might pertain to seeing clients breached or specific types of phishing attempts that you may be receiving, that type of thing. So just a reminder here that, Reg SID definitely is going to be on the table in the examination process, and people should be preparing for that out here.
So you mentioned continuously updating red flags as part of the Reg SID policies and procedures. Do you have any tips of identifying or how to identify red flags outside of that current list, especially for individuals who are responsible for wire transfers?
Well, I think, first you have to take a look at what kind of events are taking place at your firm. And so if you are receiving attempts for wire fraud or other IT security attempts, what is the nature of them? Are they coming to you from clients? Are they, somewhat standard attempts to initiate a wire? How intelligent are those attempts that are taking place? could those attempts reveal that breach has taken place somewhere else? So I think the first thing to do before you're going to create a red flag is just say, what's our experience here? And a lot of firms, the people who are managing the wiring process have a great deal of experience. They understand it very well. The major custodians, the major banks are very good these days at training as far as identity theft is concerned. So they can always be enlisted. One of the staple requirements of Reg SID is that you train on identity theft, and so we've tried to broaden that into a more general training, which includes wiring process, but also about IT security. So I think in the creation of red flags, you always have to take a look at what's happened at your firm, and are you omitting anything? That's the real mistake that Voya made. They had previous attempts for bad guys or black hats to impersonate registered reps at the firm. In other words, several months beforehand, there were numerous attempts that took place. Voya failed to update their red flags based on those attempts. They failed to sort of acknowledge that shot across the bow. And, the lesson for me, or if we're talking to advisors, is really, don't diminish the shots across the bow, whether they're clumsy phishing attempts or whether you actually see personnel at the firm. If you see their names used in phishing attempts, that's something that really bothers us. Sometimes it belies a level of intelligence. So pay attention to those shots across the bow. When we see firms that are being aggressively phished, if there's any intelligence to them that might be garnered from LinkedIn or your online presence, et cetera, we are advising people that they are under attack, and you have to treat it seriously. And in some cases, we see people continue to knock on the door for years. So just to mention that, those are some of the things I would consider. What type of events are taking place at your firm? And I would take and interpret red flags quite broadly. MSP breach you have to be aware of. In the course of the past year, some estimates have it as 50 or 60 managed service providers. These are IT providers that that take care of your firm. Again, these are the people that are supposed to be protecting you, but they're the obvious target for hackers out there. And the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI warned about this back into October 2018. The alert is on the right side. You can read it. That's a great alert as far as asking questions of your IT provider. What do they do to secure their remote management tools if they're accessing your systems? What does your MSP or what do your IT people do for securing passwords at their business? How are they, if they are hosting applications like antivirus at their firm, how are they protecting it? Here we are talking to advisors and saying you've got to get two-factor in place. We've seen cases where MSPs have been breached because they have not had two-factor in place. So you have to be, the MSPs are a real target right now. It calls for a higher level of due diligence. These firms have to provide you with their security requirements and business continuity plans. But in addition to that, I think you want to scratch the surface, go a little bit deeper. What are the critical applications that your IT provider uses, and and dig a little bit deeper about their security practices. They're a target, and unfortunately, registered investment advisors are being exposed. So this is a great example of why due diligence and why a deep level of due diligence is necessary, especially for your most critical vendors.
Would it be fair, or would it be smart to ask your vendors or your MSPs the same questions that they're trying to implement for you? Ensure that they have the same policies and procedures that they're helping you implement?
I think that's absolutely fine. And here's the reason. What's the SEC expecting from you? Vendor management is one of those 6 points in the 2015 Cybersecurity Examination Initiative. They're expecting you to conduct due diligence of your critical vendors. So the notion being that if that vendor or that IT provider isn't up to par with you, or it doesn't have practices in place that you would like, you're liable to move on or use another vendor that meets your standard. So it's really the advisor that sets the standard. It's tough for people to realize that because we're talking to IT people. They're very authoritative. They seem to know what they're doing, but how is the business really run? And, is the business growing aggressively? Are they growing too aggressively to manage security? Are they rolling up other IT vendors? And so you can search some of those managed security provider breaches, either recently on the West Coast, or there's another story just in the news this week in New York where an MSP, a cloud provider, was breached by Sodinokibi ransomware. Sodinokibi ransomware has been a real problem out here, and when we're having more arcane discussions, we talk about the way that works, etc. But you have to topple these people over from the standpoint of, there's enough breach taking place from IT security providers that we need to sit down and ask you some serious questions. And it's the obligation of the investment advisors to sort of say, are these people up to snuff? Are they meeting what we're doing? We're asking them to help two-factor authentication, get two-factor authentication in place. By the way, what do you do at your firm about this? Is it implemented? Are you experts at implementing it? Do you know the right tool set and apps to use? Do you use SMS text or one-time passwords? What are the applications you use? So make no mistake about it, there can be complexity to implementing two-factor authentication and difficulties with that process. However, it's something that's worth pausing and making sure that you have in place. I hope that answers, Tom.
Yes, it does. Thank you. Alrighty. So Tim, thank you very much for presenting with me here for cybersecurity. Would also like to thank Pete for hosting this event with Pinnacle. If you guys do have any questions with regards to the implementation of your compliance program or some certain technical aspects, here are our contact details. With that being said, once again, thank you very much.
This is Pete McGrady. Let me just jump in real quick, gentlemen. As we went through this, we had a couple easy questions to tackle. One was, are the slides available for distribution? And if they are, we'll make sure that in the follow-up email following this webinar that we include it. Do you know off the top of your head whether this is compliance approved to be shared with the listeners, Tom?
Yes, so the recording will be posted on our social media and available on our Advisor Cloud 360 technology platform as well. So for current clients of Advisor Assist, but also prospective clients out there as well, that will be available to the public.
Perfect. And then there was one technical question here that I'll throw out there. Says my AT&T mobile hotspot Wi-Fi doesn't always work outside of the U.S. Any suggestions? So I'm guessing as a layperson that means that this advisor is relying on the mobile hotspot Wi-Fi to be a secure way to access information, but it doesn't work when he's traveling. Any thoughts on that?
Well, this is Tim, and my thoughts would be VPN is an effective tool, and there can be access at several overseas locations for VPN. I mean, we've helped clients put that in for global travelers, and we've even put custom VPN solutions in place for people traveling to Australia, New Zealand, things like that. So I think the hotspot is a great solution, a great secure solution. It works very well. With Apple, it's an easy connect, and all of a sudden you're online, and it's a good secure connection. But in many cases, you're right, it will not connect. And what I would say to you is that if you really need access at those times, the next thing to consider is VPN access, which is very common overseas. And as long as you can obtain an internet connection or a Wi-Fi connection, VPN works very well in deployment overseas.
And an additional question just came in. Is biometric security as good as dual factor?
This is Tim again. From my standpoint, biometric can serve as your second factor, and so far we found it to be very effective. We're always concerned about what's behind biometric and how it's implemented. And the reason is because whether it's a second factor, whether it's a password, or whether it's a biometric, a fingerprint, if the facial recognition, etc., there usually is a hash associated with it, and so there may be ways that people can get at it. But I would tell you, by and large, biometric, can be considered your second factor. But the litmus test for us is there a publicly accessible cloud platform? And if there is a publicly accessible cloud platform where people can attempt to enter a username and a password, then biometric may not be enough if it's not addressing those. Two-factor authentication is really the great protection for. I apologize for using the Office 365 example so much, but Google services, Office 365, file sharing services like Dropbox, Ignite, etc. Those are services that can be accessed via an internet connection globally. And you can be assured that if you do not have two-factor in place, someone is attempting to get at those platforms. And just a quick note I'll mention, same thing is true for your family. If you haven't considered it, please go home, two-factor everything, financial accounts, your personal email, etc. Think of your spouses and your children as well. I force it on all my family. They hate me for doing it, but I force them all to have a enterprise security, enterprise password manager, and also to have two-factor in place.
Thank you very much. So with that, that's the last of our questions, and our time is about up here. So we're going to wrap up the program. As I want to thank both Tom and Tim for their gracious extension of their time and their sharing their vast knowledge on this topic. I also want to reiterate what Tom said. If you have additional questions and you are already a Pinnacle or an Advisor Assist customer, you can reach out directly to your compliance specialist if you have additional follow-up questions. If you're not currently working with Pinnacle or Advisor Assist or Artemis Global Security, you can see the contact information here on the screen. It will also be included in the follow-up communications. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and look forward to speaking to you in the future. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.